So you're fresh into course 2, excited to be making robots or rocket ships or whatever, but then you hop into 2001 and realize beam theory is hard. Now what? Well, you came to the right place. This video should give you more of an intuition on common beam dynamics and serve as a review video for exams. We'll be covering uniaxial loading, elastic perfectly plastic, and viscoelastic materials. This video seems to already have a basic background in these topics, but if you need a refresher, feel free to hit the hyperlinks to more in-depth videos throughout the lesson. Let's start with the essentials. You have a beam made of a uniform material. You know it has physical properties like mass, length, and cross-sectional surface area, but it also has a special material property called modulus of elasticity, abbreviated as E. The modulus of elasticity measures the stiffness of a material, or how willing it will be to stretch or compress when a force is applied to it. A low modulus of elasticity means a material is very stretchable, whereas a high modulus means a material is very stiff. You've also learned that the modulus is equal to stress over strain in this equation, but what exactly are stress and strain? Stress is defined as the normal force through a beam over its cross-sectional area. Therefore, as an engineer, you can reduce the stress in a beam by either decreasing the external forces acting on it or by increasing its surface area. For a beam of uniform material, the normal force will always be equal across any cross-section. You can find this normal force by simply cutting the beam at various points and using force balance to find the normal force at the cut location. Strain is defined as the change in beam length over the unstretched length. It's important to notice that if there are forces acting along the length of the beam, the strain will not necessarily be constant. Finding the strain at an individual point can be done by slicing the beam at that point, finding the stress via a free body diagram, and solving for strain with the equation for Young's modulus. Note that the internal force does not cause a strain on the free end of the beam. Now you can also use your definition of Young's modulus on composite beams made up of multiple materials. Commonly, these beams will show up as a core material surrounded by a sleeve material. The individual cross-sections of the beam will stay intact as you stretch or compress the beam, so in this way the strain of the beam stays constant along the cross-sectional surface area. For a uniform beam, we would rearrange the Young's modulus equation like this to solve for strain. The equation is very similar for composite beams. The only difference is the EA term is turned into EA effective, or the effective material stiffness of the beam. This can be derived as the sum of all the different moduli in the beams times their cross-sectional surface areas. Now, everything in this video so far has applied to materials in a perfectly elastic state. Essentially what this means is that if you stretch or compress them, they'll snap back to their original size afterwards with no repercussion. There are two other common kinds of materials, elastic perfectly plastic and viscoelastic. Let's start with elastic perfectly plastic materials. Consider the graph of stress versus strain for an elastic material. Note that the stress and strain are directly related, and the slope of the graph will be E. If an elastic beam is loaded such that its stress and strain increase, and then it is unloaded, note that it will simply revert to its original configuration. At low stresses, elastic perfectly plastic materials will act elastically and follow this graph. However, once they reach a certain stress level, known as the yield stress, their stress level can no longer increase. Applying further force on the beam will cause it to deform further, increasing strain, but note that the stress remains at the yield stress. If the beam is then unloaded and all the stress in it is removed, it will attempt to revert back to its original configuration. Just like in an elastic beam, it will move back to zero stress with a slope of E. The difference though is that all the strain accumulated after the beam reaches its yield stress is irrecoverable. This leftover strain, called the plastic strain, means that the unloaded beam will be slightly longer than the original. Viscoelastic materials are different. Imagine tuning a guitar so all the strings are nice and tight. You play Wonderwall for your friends and put away your guitar, but when you come back in 2 weeks, you find all the strings are loose again. Why is this? A guitar string is a prime example of a viscoelastic material, one in which the stress or strain will change over time. Viscoelastic materials are modeled in a way very similar to elastic materials. Imagine for a second you have an elastic beam that you apply a constant stress to. You can solve for the strain fairly easily by rearranging the modulus equation. If this beam was viscoelastic, over time it would stretch out more. This stretch is modeled by replacing the modulus of elasticity in our equation with a function known as the creep compliance function. Note that the creep function scales with e to the negative t, so over time the amount the beam stretches will go to 0. Also take note of the three new variables. E0 represents the immediate modulus of the material. In the instant stress is applied to the beam, it can be treated as an elastic beam with a modulus E0. Likewise, E infinity represents the modulus of the material after a long time. After this time, the beam can be treated as an elastic beam with modulus E infinity. Tc is the creep time, a constant that describes how fast the material's modulus will change from E0 to E infinity. The creep compliance function models changes in strain when stress is constant. On the other hand, the relaxation function models changes in stress when strain is constant. Consider again an elastic beam, but this time it has a constant strain applied to it. The stress can be found with this equation, but if the beam is viscoelastic, then over time the stress in the beam will actually decrease, and the beam will, wait for it, relax. This can be modeled by replacing the modulus with the relaxation function, which uses the same variables as the creep compliance function, but uses the constant TR, or relaxation time, to model the speed of change from E0 to E infinity. The difficulty of beam theory really stems from a lack of intuition, which I hope this video shed some light on.